This episode is going to be a little different from most of the other Talk About Talk podcast episodes that you may have heard. The topic of today's episode was inspired by a question that I received at a Q&A, a question and answer period that I held just earlier this week. This Q&A was hosted on LinkedIn Live, and the topic was establishing your professional identity and your personal brand. Some of my favorite topics, right? Let me tell you what this particular question was. The question from one of the viewers was, Andrea, how do I broadcast my brand? A pretty simple question, right? I had an answer immediately, and this answer is the truth. It's my truth, and it's this. I am obsessed with listing and categorizing the infinite number of ways that we communicate our brand, or as he said, broadcast our brand. Think about it. We're communicating our brand directly through our words and indirectly through things like our body language or our tone of voice. We're also communicating constantly online and in person. The number of ways that we broadcast our personal brand or our professional identity is, in fact, infinite. So it's not like I was telling him something that wasn't true. But it occurred to me after this LinkedIn Live that perhaps he was looking for something a little bit more actionable. And that's when I decided to turn this into a podcast episode. Today, in this podcast episode, I'm going to answer the question again. And as you may have gathered from the title, I'm going to share with you 5 specific and significant ways that you can reinforce your personal brand or your professional identity starting right now. Are you ready?
Let's do this. Let's talk about talk.
Welcome to Talk About Talk podcast episode number 156. 5 ways to reinforce your professional identity. In case we haven't met, my name is Dr. ANDREA Wojnicki. Please just call me Andrea. I'm your executive communication coach. I coach ambitious executives like you to improve their communication skills so you can communicate with confidence and clarity. And then you can establish credibility. And then you can create impact, ultimately achieving your career goals. Sound good? If you want to learn more, check out talkabouttalk.com. I've got lots and lots of resources for you there. I've got one-on-one coaching, there's boot camps, there's information about corporate workshops, there's the archive of this bi-weekly podcast. And while you're at talkabouttalk.com, I really hope you'll sign up for my email newsletter. That newsletter is your chance to get free communication coaching from me. Sound good? All right, let's get into this. Here's how this episode's going to go. First, I'm going to define for you what I mean by professional identity and personal brand. It's really important that we are starting from this common foundation. Then I'm going to elaborate a little bit on my original answer to this question of how do we broadcast our brand? And then I'm going to share with you 5 specific and significant ways that you can reinforce your personal brand. So we're going to get a little more actionable here. All right. First, defining a personal brand. If you've been following the Talk About Talk podcast or receiving the newsletter, you might be familiar with this, but I'm going to say it again. Your personal brand is your identity or your reputation. You can almost use those as synonyms. Jeff Bezos has a fantastic definition of your personal brand that I like to use. It's more like a mental exercise. He says, your brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. Now, of course, you do have a brand when you are in the room. This is more, as I said, like a mental exercise. So imagine, if you will, some important stakeholders, maybe your boss and your boss's boss, or if you're an entrepreneur, maybe it's an investor or a collaborator, is talking about you. Your name comes up in conversation when you're not in the room. What are those people thinking and saying about you? That is your personal brand and your professional identity. And the thing is, we can do things to strategically optimize what it is. So my definition of personal branding is being yourself on purpose. There's really 2 elements of this, right? It's being yourself. So we are always authentic and true to ourselves. We're not inventing something, and we're certainly not being dishonest. It is authentic and true. We are being ourselves. The second part of this definition is that we are doing this on purpose. So we are offering no apologies for the fact that we are being strategic and disciplined about controlling our narrative and making sure that we are presenting our ideal or optimized personal brand. So what's the difference between a personal brand and a professional identity? I just want to clarify this a little bit. So in the work that I do with executives, I use these two words synonymously. A personal brand is your reputation or identity, and it includes your whole self. On the other hand, your professional identity is also your whole self, but looked through the lens of your career or your profession or what you do for a living. So you may prioritize some of your more professional endeavors and activities and accomplishments ahead of more personal things, but those are still part of you. All right? As I said before, it is your whole self. So we've got that out of the way. We have defined personal brand. When I'm coaching folks on establishing their personal brand, we have a process that we follow. There's really two main steps. Step one is creating or articulating your brand, and step two is communicating it. So I always say that what may differentiate the way I coach personal branding versus other personal branding coaches is I focus way, way more on step one. I've seen countless examples consistently of where executives are focusing on establishing their unique identity. And before you skip to the second step of communicating your brand, it's really important that we nail that. So we typically spend about 75% of our time, give or take, on step one, which is creating or articulating your brand. And then we move over into step two, which is communicating your personal brand. This, by the way, was the question that I received in the Q&A session, where the gentleman said, "Andrea, how do we broadcast our personal brand?" This was step two of the process. This is the communication step. My answer, as I said earlier in this episode, was that there are infinite ways that we communicate our personal brand. I've become sort of obsessed over the last several years in creating this list and making it as complete as I can. For the purpose of the workshops that I do and the coaching of executives that I do, I've put this list into a 2x2. So it's like a 2x2 matrix like they do in consulting, where on one dimension of the matrix, we're looking at considering the direct versus the indirect or implicit ways that we communicate. So let me just define what I mean by that. The direct ways that we communicate our brand are through words, right? You are explicitly using words, whether it's verbal or written, to share your strengths, your expertise, your superpowers, and so on. So that's direct. And then indirectly, you're also communicating your personal brand through things like your meeting background, how you dress, your hair, your tone of voice, your punctuality. These are all signals that other people are interpreting about you to identify what your personal brand is. Sometimes we don't pay as much attention to the implicit things, but the truth is that we're all out there trying to identify and decipher what other people are all about. So we're looking for signals to reinforce the judgments that we've made. So on one side of our 2x2, we've got the direct versus indirect ways that we communicate our personal brand. And then on the other side of the 2x2, we have in person and online. So when we're in person, we can see the person's body. It's body language, right? And there are many things that cross over those, but you can think of 4 categories or different ways of thinking about and maybe even brainstorming different ways that we communicate, or as this gentleman said, broadcast our personal brand. Again, direct and indirect or implicit, online and in person. So that was the answer that I gave this gentleman in the Q&A at the LinkedIn Live that I did earlier this week. Since then, as I mentioned earlier, I've been ruminating a little bit about not providing him with a real actionable list of different ways that he and we all can reinforce or broadcast our professional identity. So I've come up with a list of 5 now that I'm going to share with you. And these are 5 that I believe, based on my experience personally, but also professionally, coaching hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of executives on how to establish their personal brand. These are the ones that seem to get a lot of traction. I'm going to read them to you first, and then I'm going to elaborate on them. So the first one is your self-introduction. The second one is speaking up in meetings and how you do that. The third one is demonstrating thought leadership. The fourth one is mentoring, teaching, and learning. And the last one is being active and visible. So I'm going to elaborate now on each of those 4 things. The first one is your self-introduction. And I think I did actually say this at the LinkedIn Live earlier this week. Your self-introduction is unquestionably the most direct way for you to reinforce your personal brand. Let me say that again. Your self-introduction is the most direct way for you to reinforce your personal brand or your professional identity. Why is this? Well, very often your self-introduction is a first impression. And we know that first impressions are very important impressions, right? So there's that. There's the significance of it. It's also coming from you. So it's highly credible. And it's through words which are direct, words that you choose. So how could any other format of communicating, any other media, any other broadcast media be any more direct than your very own self-introduction? I can guess what some of you are thinking. Man, I was already nervous with my self-introductions. Now I'm really, really nervous about my self-introductions. I have an answer for you on that. The number 1 Talk About Talk podcast episode of all time in terms of downloads is episode number 86, a simple framework to introduce yourself. I'm going to teach it to you right now really quickly. If you've already heard it, this is just a review and I want you to still follow along. So the 3 steps for you to introduce yourself with confidence that you can customize for any context is this: present, past, future. Present, past, future. It is not chronological. Let me quickly take you through what this framework is. Step number 1, present tense. Hi, my name is Dr. ANDREA Wojnicki, and I'm an executive communication coach at Talk About Talk. This is actually how most of us start our self-introductions. State who you are, your name, where you work, and you can elaborate a little bit. If you've done some work on your personal brand, you might talk about your strengths or your passions or something about the work that you're doing. Okay? So step 1 is present tense. You're just telling them who you are. Step 2 is past. Here's where, in a professional context, you establish credibility. Previously, I worked at Kraft Foods in brand marketing, and I earned my doctorate of business at Harvard Business School. So whatever the details are that you want to share, it could be an award you won, it could be a project that you just finished, it could be a previous employer where you worked. Typically, I suggest sharing between 1 and 3 details that will help you establish credibility in this step 2. So you've started with the present, you've moved to the past, and you've established credibility. This is where a lot of people end their self-introduction. They say, yeah, and that's me, and on to the next person. If you really want to put the icing on the cake here, which I hope you do, you're going to finish your self-introduction with a enthusiastic, positive, future-oriented statement, ideally related to the person that you're meeting. So you could say, I'm really looking forward to this kickoff meeting, and I know we are going to rock this project. Or, and now I'd really like to learn more about you. Or say you're at a networking event at a conference. You could say, I'm really looking forward to getting to know people, including all of you, and learning more from this conference, right? So it's future-oriented, it's positive, and it's enthusiastic. Your self-introduction, as I said, is the most direct way that you have to reinforce your personal brand. So in each of these 3 steps, present, past, and future, note that it's not chronological. You're not sharing your autobiography or your biography. You're not starting from when you were born up to today. Start with the present, go back, establish credibility, and then end with a future-oriented statement. In each of these 3 steps, you can reinforce the professional identity that you want to reinforce, or as this gentleman said, broadcast. So perhaps in step 1, the present tense, you might identify your superpowers. So sometimes when I'm introducing myself, I'll say, my passion and my expertise is coaching ambitious executives on their communication skills, right? Because that is my superpower. You could say something like that. And then in step 2, past tense, where you're establishing credibility, identify the 1 to 3 things that are really going to reinforce the things that you want to reinforce with the particular audience that you're introducing yourself to. And then even with the future tense statement. So we're going to move on in the list, but the number 1 most direct and important way for you to reinforce your personal brand is the self-introduction. If you haven't already listened to episode number 86 of Talk About Talk podcast, I encourage you to do so. And as you're listening to it, ask yourself, what would I say about myself in each of these 3 steps that's going to help me reinforce my professional identity? All right, moving on in our list, the second way to reinforce your professional identity is speaking up in meetings. Interestingly, I was having a coaching session just earlier today with a really ambitious, really smart young manager. And he said that he sometimes feels a little bit tongue-tied in meetings. He said, I generally am very well prepared, but sometimes, inevitably, things come up in the meetings that I haven't prepared for. And I feel like I don't know what to say. And I said to him, listen, we've done all of this work on your personal brand. If you're feeling nervous before you go into a meeting, make your personal branding document the last thing that you look at before you go into the meeting. And then if you're ever feeling tongue-tied or you're not sure what to say, lean in on your experience, your expertise, and your background. And this is my suggestion for you here. When it comes to speaking up in meetings and reinforcing your personal brand, there are several cues that you can use, or almost like scripts for starting your comments in meetings. For example, you could say, based on my background in strategic marketing, I have a suggestion, right? So what you're doing is you're anchoring your comments in your legitimate, authentic background, your expertise, which reminds me of the second cue, which is based on my expertise in. So as an academic, I can say based on my expertise in marketing, or based on my expertise in consumer behavior, whatever. Or you could say based on my experience. So this is a great one. You could say based on my experience in the project that we did last quarter, or based on my recent experience with a similar client, right? And suddenly people are leaning in because it's almost like an objective way of categorizing or labeling what's to come in terms of your expertise. And what you're doing there is you're reinforcing, you're categorizing, or you're labeling what your own expertise is to everybody else in the room. I hope that makes sense. My point is this: you don't have to answer every question that comes up when you're speaking up in meetings with a definitive answer. You can narrow your answer in terms of the context of your personal brand or your professional identity. So if you've taken the time to articulate and establish your personal brand, you know in your mind what makes you unique and what your strengths are, you can use these cues when you're speaking up in meetings. So remind people again by saying, based on my background, based on my expertise, or based on my experience. I know it works. I've done it myself, and I've coached many, many people who have done so successfully. All right, so we are on to number 3. We've covered the self-introduction, and we've covered reinforcing your professional identity by speaking up in meetings. The third one is demonstrating thought leadership. So once you've taken the time to identify and articulate the elements, the various themes of your personal brand, including your expertise, it's time to establish thought leadership. In a recent podcast episode, I interviewed Roger Martin, my past boss at the University of Toronto, who very succinctly highlighted that there's a difference between private and public thought leadership. And I think this is important to note here. You don't necessarily need to become a public thought leader, although you may want to, and I encourage you to do so. But you definitely, if you are a leader, need to at least be a private thought leader, private being internal to your firm. People need to know what your expertise is. And I'm not just talking about being the CEO. At all levels of leadership, we should have a stake in the ground in terms of what our thought leadership is. It's really, really important. So how do we do so? Well, actually, my previous suggestion of reinforcing your personal brand by how you speak up in meetings, literally defining what your comment is in terms of establishing your thought leadership, right? You're saying, my expertise, based on my expertise, based on my experience. That's you identifying what your thought leadership is. So it could be just speaking up in meetings. It also could be writing papers. You can post things on LinkedIn. You can share articles. You can create a podcast. You can do public speaking. You can join a panel, right? Just think about the multiple media that you have to share thought leadership. And I have a little secret for you here that never crossed my mind until maybe a couple years ago. And that is the people that are true thought leaders are also not afraid to share other people's thought leadership. In other words, it's not just writing and thinking that came from you, but also secondhand. I noticed that one thought leader that I admire very much, Adam Grant, does this a lot. He brings guests onto his podcast, and he also recommends books by people that you might think are direct or at least indirect competitors of his, but he's so focused on establishing thought leadership and sharing his insights with others that he welcomes it. So here's my bonus insight for you here when it comes to sharing thought leadership. It's not just your own thought leadership, you can also share other people's thought leadership. How exactly might you do this? You're probably wondering. Here's an easy one. On LinkedIn, if you find a post written by someone else or maybe an article, share it to your community or your network on social media and say, here's a great article about, like I do this, here's a great article about personal branding. They list 7 things. I would add an 8th, right? So you're further reinforcing your own expertise by elaborating on what the other person said and maybe responding to it, but you're also encouraging other people to read it. And you're establishing the fact that you are the go-to person in that area. All right, so I hope that's clear. Now we've covered 3 different ways to reinforce your professional identity. It's your self-introduction, it's how you speak up in meetings, and it's your thought leadership, both your own and sharing others. The 4th way to broadcast your professional identity is mentoring, teaching, and learning. You've probably heard, and I know I've heard this so many times over the decades, that the last step to learning is teaching. It occurred to me as I was pulling together these 5 ways to reinforce your professional identity that actually teaching and mentoring is a very, very strong signal of your expertise. So if there's an element of your professional identity or your expertise that you think you could teach others, I encourage you to do so. This will just reinforce what your professional identity is. Let me share with you an example. I'm coaching a senior partner at a global firm right now, and we've been working on developing her personal brand. And her personal brand, we think her superpower is people leadership, right? At a macro and a micro level, both culturally and individually. She's a fantastic mentor, and she's definitely shaping the culture of the organization. So I've encouraged her, consistent with this 4th way of reinforcing your professional identity, to also teach other people to do the same, right? So the junior partners and the managers that are reporting to her, who also have direct reports, she's coaching them on how they can become people leaders. You see how it works? Take the expertise that you want to be known for and coach other people to do that. And other people will see you as an expert in that domain. Okay, on to the 5th way to reinforce your professional identity. It's this: be active and visible. Remember at the very beginning when I defined what your personal brand is, and I said, based on Jeff Bezos' definition, your brand could be seen as what other people say about you when you're not in the room? Here's the thing. If they haven't seen you very often, they might not think anything. And then the person that has been around is going to get promoted or is going to get the financing or is going to benefit from the collaboration, right? So you need to be visible and active. What does this mean? Well, this is a strong argument for going into the office or meeting people for coffee, meeting people for lunches, right? Going to events. Make yes your default. Whenever you're invited to a conference or a meal or a meeting or an event, make yes your default. Of course, you're not going to be able to do it all, but you want to be visible and you want to be active. And this is really important, both online and offline. So honestly, I could create another infinite list from here, but make yes your default. Engage with your firm and your industry and all the people that you work with whenever you can, through lunches, through coffees, through networking events, through social media, right? Through conferences. Make yes your default. Say yes, be active, and be visible. All right, that's it. That's everything for this podcast, episode number 156. Let me review with you again here quickly the 5 ways to reinforce your professional identity. The challenge that I have for you is to identify which one or 2 of these you're going to take action on right now so that you can improve your professional identity. Here they are again. Number 1, your self-introduction. Remember the framework: present, past, future. And remember to integrate your professional identity into each of those 3 steps. Number 2 is speaking up in meetings. 3 prompts that I suggest for you are based on my background, based on my experience, and based on my expertise. The 3rd way to reinforce your professional identity is demonstrating thought leadership. Your thought leadership, and yes, even others, online and in person. Remember, there's many ways to demonstrate your thought leadership, publicly and privately as well. The 4th way to reinforce your professional identity is mentoring, teaching, and learning. If you are a mentor and a teacher, you're going to be seen as an expert, and you need to continuously learn about your area of expertise. The 5th and last way to reinforce your professional identity is to be active and visible. Make your default yes whenever you're invited to lunch, to coffee, to a conference, to a networking event, and get out there online and in person on social media, across whatever media it is. Just say yes, be active and visible. All right, that's it for this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, I hope you will refer it to one of your friends. And I also hope that you'll leave me a review on Apple or Spotify or YouTube or wherever you're listening to this podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and talk soon.